welcome to Policy Exchange. My name's Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. I have the pleasure of being your host this evening for this inaugural event of our Thatcher Centenary celebrations, in particular on this occasion, of course, on the night of the 50th anniversary of the leadership ballot that deposed Edward Heath and led to her subsequent elevation. Particular pleasure to do this here at a think tank because ideas mattered to Margaret Thatcher. She didn't claim to be an original thinker herself, but she valued them enormously and paid great attention to ideas and to policy development and to how those ideas would be implemented in practice. And she got it very right, first in opposition from 75 to 79, and perhaps even harder in government thereafter with the many contending pressures. And she got it overwhelmingly right and showed how to get it overwhelmingly right and showed the importance of ideas, both in theory and in practice, how to do it. There are subsequent examples. 2017, the social care, ill-conceived social care policy, the so-called dementia tax, and then during a brief 44-day premiership in 2022, when if you don't get the ideas right beforehand and the implementation of policy, quite how disastrous it can be. So that is partly what brings us together tonight. And the person who's brought it all together so brilliantly for us is our senior fellow who's leading our Thatcher Centenary workstream, Charles Moore, Lord Moore of Etchingham, former chairman, obviously author of one of the great political biographies of all time, standing comparison with Moneypenny and Buckle on Disraeli, Randolph Churchill, and Martin Gilbert on Winston Churchill. And that, of course, is Lord Moore of Etchingham. So please, thank you, Charles, for your time. Should also say a particular word of thanks in helping to organise tonight to Lady Wakeham, who's been of such invaluable assistance to us in organising. Of course, will be one of the panellists and was obviously private secretary to Mrs. Thatcher in 1975 when she won the leadership ballot, and that of great value. But Charles will introduce all of our guests as chair of this first session on Reminiscences of 75. But it's also, we like to surprise you, and the great pleasure here tonight being able to welcome Carol Thatcher here, I think in the words of contemporary jargon, her lived experience is greater than that of anyone here, but she will have some further reminiscences of her own later on towards the end of proceedings tonight. We're delighted to be able to welcome her here tonight. And as you all know, the second part of the evening will be after due drinks, food. As you all know, the old line about think tanks, 1/4 about thinking, 3/4 about catering, and so we will offer you drinks, and then the second half will be on lessons of Margaret Thatcher's career going forward at this particular low moment, perhaps, in the broad fortunes of the Conservative Party and the broader centre-right. So please join me in welcoming all our guests tonight and looking forward to what happens.
I'll just very quickly explain what we're going to do. As Dean has said, it's two parts, and we want to concentrate in the first part really in pure memory rather than political analysis. We want you to get the feeling of what it was like 50 years ago today. And actually, though Margaret Thatcher didn't become the leader of the party till the following week when she beat Willie Whitelaw, today's vote was the key vote because it was the one that made it perfectly clear what was happening. And I've just checked in a reference work that I possess. The postal votes pulled Mrs. Thatcher ahead, interestingly. There were some. One of the abstentions was thought to have been Michael Heseltine. Another, by mistake, was Jim Pryor because his train arrived too late. But the actual vote was 16 for Hugh Fraser, husband at that time of the famous Lady Antonia, 119 for Edward Heath, and 130 for Margaret Thatcher. That triggered the resignation of Heath and the second ballot, and which she won more convincingly. But she won it convincingly enough on the first for it to be clear what the momentum was. So here, everybody here on this panel remembers it and was, in some sense or other, a participant. So going from the right, Nigel Vinson, entrepreneur, and now Lord Vinson, long been Lord Vinson actually, and he was a moving spirit in the foundation of the Centre for Policy Studies, which began in between the two elections in 1974, and was very much the instrument of Margaret Thatcher under the patronage of Keith Joseph in coming through with new ideas and beginning to make a great impact. And then I'll move from left to right, I'll keep moving this way I think, back and forth. On my far left is John O'Sullivan, who was a lead writer and sketch writer on the Daily Telegraph at the time. And the Daily Telegraph had a rather curious position in which it formally supported Ted Heath, but really it didn't. And, and one of the people who really didn't was John. And so when he wasn't writing leaders, perhaps in favour of Ted Heath, I don't know, because you have to write what the editor tells you to write in a leader, was helping Mrs. Thatcher in her campaign and was very much a witness to all of it. And then on my right, the person who I think we can definitely say knew Lady Thatcher better personally than anybody else on the panel, and almost anybody else in the room, with an important exception, is Alison Wakeham, Lady Wakeham, who at that time was Alison Ward, and had been Mrs. Thatcher's secretary, constituency secretary originally, I think that's right, isn't it, since 1971, and was now her, I think it's fair to say, her main secretary at this key point. And then on my left, the person who in some ways had a particularly difficult task, William Waldegrave, who'd been, I think, maybe not effectively political secretary for Ted Heath in number 10, but I think maybe a different title, but that was what it was really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Political secretary. Yeah.
Political secretary, yes. And therefore had left number 10 in February, but continued with Ted Heath and was doing that job for him at the key point. Lord Waldegrave, of course, went on to have a very distinguished political career, and I think you were the last person that Mrs. Thatcher appointed to a cabinet.
That's correct, yeah.
But of course, that was only a matter of a few days, but then he had a long and distinguished period.
I scored 0 in the game pointless, because as cabinet ministers appointed by Mrs. Thatcher, nobody got me, so...
So this is our panel, and as Dean mentioned, there will be a special guest appearance when we have concluded these little bit of the proceedings by Carol, who has some very nice things to tell us and read us. So I will start, if I may, because I just want to go back a tiny bit before the actual night, to you, Nigel Vinson. Right. Just to tell us, please, about the Centre for Policy Studies and Mrs. Thatcher's role in it, because it began, it wasn't a thing that pre-existed, it began in that time, didn't it, between the February and October elections?
Well, I got recruited by, really by Keith Joseph, and my memories are more closely associated with him, and he finalised by getting married in our house, so, and I was ultimately his executor, so we became very close over the years. At that stage I had sold my business and I had joined the IEA thinking that it represented all the values that I and I think everybody in this room think are so important. And Keith and Margaret were having lunch there one day and they said, we're looking for somebody to set up a think tank for us because Heath won't like it, but we really must do something different. And so I got the task and somebody said to me, you're a whiz kid before you turn into a was kid. Anyway, I think just briefly, of course, the centre was responsible for both the creation of the policies that she so deeply cared for, all of which were based on ownership. She was a huge believer in the importance of ownership, houses, pensions, shares, you name it, because once people own, they belong. And she recognised that very early.
Yes, thank you. And We'll come back to the. Well, perhaps I could just ask you, Nigel, on this. Do you actually remember a moment when Keith, because Keith was, of course, the person most talked about as the possible leader of, at least from the candidate from the right. Do you remember the moment when it became clear that that wasn't so and that it was going to be Margaret?
Well, Keith approached me and said, Nigel, should I stand for the premiership? And I said, well, I'm probably the last person to ask, but Keith, if I might say, had been, as a wickedness, had been taught to doubt. And he simply could not make his mind up. And I said, Keith, it'll kill you if you've got the job. It really isn't for you. And well, it was that, but he subsequently declined it.
Thank you very much. So, William, you had a bruising time because the February '74 election didn't have to be called. They could have waited. But Ted Heath had decided to call it on Who Governs Britain, and the electorate had returned a rather confused answer, and he had left. Tell us about what happened after that, and how likely was it that he would go? How much were you trying to fight to keep him? What was? Did you see Mrs. Thatcher coming up?
I feel rather like the representative of the French at a reunion to celebrate the Battle of Waterloo. You remember Dominique de Villepin said that the French won the Battle of Waterloo because they thereby avoided the Industrial Revolution and dominated the market in clothes, scent and food, which is much more satisfactory. Yes. There'd been a battle and a division actually about the timing of the election. Should it have gone earlier or later? Acid old Enoch, remember, said if it had all been 3 weeks earlier or 3 weeks later, history would have been different. So there were divided councils and battles around Ted. After the loss of the election, we went into a sort of surreal phase because in May, what did we do? But we went off to see Mao Zedong, accompanied by the world's press in a quite extraordinary way, which made Ted, Chinese thought, all this election nonsense, this fellow's a youngster, he'll be there for the next 30 years. So they treated him as if he was Prime Minister, which greatly reinforced, I think, his sort of disjunction. But it was perfectly clear to anybody that after losing one election, there were going to be questions about the leadership. What then happened during the summer, we had a scare, which I don't think has been recorded anyway. Here's a scoop, though. We had a scare that Peter Walker was going to lead a coup on the grounds of defending Heathism without Heath, if you like. That didn't go anywhere. I don't know whether it was true. We then had the CPS, establishment of the CPS, which was seen as a direct threat, a rival to the research department, which was run by Chris Patton. A compromise was reached that Adam Ridley, a good and great man, would be on the board of it, and that would sort of keep it all respectable. But that was clearly an opposition centre growing. Then Keith, you're quite right, Nigel, he would have hated it, but he also made a speech, you remember, that was mischievously interpreted by the press as being a speech about eugenics, which it wasn't, but never mind. Yeah. A weekend speech of Joseph's at All Souls, where I've devoted to Keith. We were colleagues at All Souls. We had a song which we sing at high occasions, where there's an extra verse put in if something special has happened. And there had been a bomb scare in the college, but it was not high explosive, but just another weekend speech of Joseph. And then, of course, and you have to remember this, the backbenchers of the Conservative MPs, who are always extremely wise in their selection of everyone, thought that just the man to have was Edward Dukhan. Now, some of us didn't take to Edward Dukhan very much, and there would have been quite a lot of people who knew too much about Edward Dukhan who would have found it very difficult to follow that. So we sort of thought that things were going rather well. Keith blew himself up. Then there was Edward Dukhan, honestly. And Ted didn't really. Meanwhile, Margaret Thatcher's star was clearly rising. He gave her an economic job and made her Environment Shadow Secretary, both of which were very important in the run-up to the second election. So but at the time of the second election, though it was clear that if the next election was a catastrophe like 1966 had been, and many people expected it to be, then Ted's position, but even if it was a loss, but if it was a catastrophe, Ted would have to, the game was over. But it wasn't quite like that. Perhaps that's where I should stop for now.
Thank you. It's very good. By the way, Edward Buchanan, there will be people here, be honest, put up your hand if you haven't heard of Edward Buchanan. I wouldn't blame you. He was the chairman of the 1922 committee, and I had a problem with this when I was writing my book, because I felt I need to describe one of the difficulties with him, which was his dealings in the city. But at the time I wrote it, and he was still alive, and the libel laws apply, so I simply had used the phrase his chiaroscuro financial background. But it was remarkable how the extent to which he had a following.
We had a pressman called Maurice Tribute. Our team, perhaps I should name,
yes.
A little team,
yeah.
Which was the leader's office consisted of me as the head of it, then three wonderful people, Penny Gummer, Sarah Heaven-Scott, and Caroline Ryder, the most efficient officer I've ever been enrolled in. Then Maurice Trowbridge was the pressman. Michael Wolfe, a wise old bird who died much too young, was a sort of political advisor and speechwriter, a nice man. And then there was the research department at Central Office, which technically was the leader's private office. So it was very difficult questions of loyalty for people working, they thought, for the Conservative Party, but also for did he. Maurice Trowbridge did for Edward by inventing the phrase the Milk Street Mafia, because they met in an office in Milk Street, and the press loved that.
Yes. Well, the Conservative Research Department was known as the enemy to us.
Yeah, quite.
Exactly. William rightly referred to the importance of Keith Joseph's speeches, and they had a double important effect. One was that they were very influential in Mrs. Thatcher's thinking, and then the other was that the last one was disastrous for Keith. And Mrs. Thatcher first heard of it when she saw a headline, on those billboardings that newspapers had. It said, Sir Keith, stop babies sensation. People accused him of saying that the lower classes were overbreeding, and that this was he was advocating eugenics. I don't really think he was, but that did for him. Where have we got to? I think we get to you now. No, Alison, sorry.
Could I just tell you, the drafts of those speeches went to 32 drafts, and each one had to be retyped in those days. Pity the poor typist, can you imagine it?
Yes. And it's extraordinary that being so, that it wasn't more noticed that there could be a sort of journalistic problem on that speech.
But he hated, Nigel was quite right. I was his junior minister in the education department. He was horrible building at Elizabeth House by the station. He looked out of the window, because he'd been planning minister long before. He'd look out of the window, modern devastation, all my fault. He beat himself up more than anybody I knew, but was a heavenly man.
Could I just say that on that narrow point, the reason the phrase the very damaging phrase got through, I think, was because it was in fact a quote from two people identified as left-wing sociologists. And I think it was thought, well, this sanitizes it from the standpoint of risk, but of course it didn't.
Yes. Alison, tell us please, you've known Mrs. Thatcher pretty well every day since 1971.
Yes.
And could you, and I think it'd be fair to say that by the time we're talking about, you were her principal secretary, and it was a tiny staff, wasn't it? Just very quickly sketch the office for us. It's so small.
The office in 1974 was quite small. It was me. And Carol might remember, I'll try and I must just give you my little Edward Buchanan story.
Please.
He was the original. He oozed charm from every pore as he oiled his way about the floor. But he had, there are some of you here who might remember, Archie might remember, he always referred to his wife as my bride. And at one time, I was with the Thatchers, I have no idea where, and he said to Dennis, and you'll want to take your bride. And it sort of wasn't incredibly well received. We left quite quickly after that. So very briefly, I went to work for Margaret Thatcher to do her constituency and personal work early in 1971. I was just 21. I was extremely naive, but I could type. And gradually, as time went on, she was Secretary of State for Education. I used to go to Finchley a great deal with her because it was a local London constituency. She went quite a lot. I seemed to go with her. Time went on. We got to 1974, and when the election was announced, she was very clear about various things, and one was we had to completely clear out her room before the election in case nobody else on that upper ministerial corridor cleared out their rooms. Anyway, so then unfortunately, come the day after polling day, having had a government department staff and a driver, she had me, but we managed, I genuinely don't know how, to get through to the end of the year. However hard I worked, and it was 12 or 14 hour days, it simply didn't register on the same thing as the amount of hours she worked. I would say it, wouldn't I, but she was unfailingly kind and generous to me. We did have fun. A lot of the general perception is that it wasn't much fun. It was fun. It was a bit rackety sometimes, and we relied on the research department. I can remember her telling me, I'd gone to collect her from the hairdresser, which was then in Albemarle Street, and she said, I need to just tell you this, I've decided I'm going to stand for the leadership, so that was fine. I just said, well, yes, and Carol will tell you later how it was received at home. I'm afraid my memory is not very good on detail. It was a long time ago. But we eventually got round to the end of the year, and Charles's book will tell you exactly how it happened.
And when she said that she would stand, how much of a surprise or not a surprise was that to you?
Well, I don't think it was a surprise because it had been much chatted about, but but it was chatted about at the same time as, well, forget it, there'll never be a woman. But the Centre for Policy Studies was very big and important in her life then. 8 Wilfrid Street, I think.
Yes.
Is it still there?
Yeah, not in a different place, but yeah.
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she did spend a lot of time there. She relied on the Conservative Research Department for briefing, which was sometimes not exactly what she had anticipated.
Thank you. By the way, I think the small scale of everything is very interesting as a comparison with modern times where people have absolute armies of people helping them all the
Can
time.
I say something about that?
Please, yes. And so just Alison, and Alison, too modest to mention this, but when she started Mrs. Thatcher, she was paid £18 a week, which is only slightly more than the minimum wage for an hour now. Yes, before we go to John William, you wanted to come in.
Just on that small point. Douglas Hurd had been political secretary to Ted through the government of 1970-74. He got a constituency. I was brought in to succeed him. So for a moment, there were 2 people in number 10, and then there was 1, just me. I think there are more than that.
Yes, there are 100 or something.
And therefore, it's obviously 100 times better.
Yes, exactly. John, please, will you take us up to you, of course, perhaps more because of your job, more conscious than anyone of how is this playing out? When did it become the case that it sort of had to be Margaret Thatcher, A, to stand, is the first point, and then to win, but first of all to stand? And what do you remember of all that?
Well, the first thing is, of course, Alison is the only legitimate Thatcherite who started with her. I mean, like Nigel, I was drawn into this by Keith. And Keith rang me up one day and said, I'd like to have a conversation with you over lunch. I said, oh, fine. And he said, I'd like to go to the Ritz. I thought, well, that's very good. And over lunch, he said, I want to start a new organisation. And this is going to do, and this is not what later happened, but it's interesting. What's going to do is it's going to be for sociology what the IEA has been for economics. And that was the idea. He was going to have a big meeting in the Albert Hall with Michael Foote on one side, himself on the other, and a huge audience in which they would debate Sweden versus the United States, that kind of thing. So it seemed a good idea to me, and therefore I was drawn into all the discussions about the speech that he made on inflation in the summer. In fact, Frank Johnson and I was my colleague, we were brought in to act like savage journalists, attacking him after the speech he'd given. And that was quite a lot of fun.
You mean pretending to be savage?
Pretended to be savage journalists, yes. We were actually quite savage to Mrs. Thatcher as speechwriters because we felt we had to be journalistically honest and so on, and treat her as badly as we treated Ted. I think we treated Jim Callaghan rather well, actually, looking back. Now, what happened then was, I was kind of part of the machine. Mrs. Thatcher I met only once in this stage, which was, she was then Education Secretary. I was with a lot of left-wing journalists in a room with her, and we had a debate and discussion. And she and I had a blazing row about educational vouchers. So that when she left, the journalists all fell about laughing. I was the only Tory there. Of course, I didn't realise then it was the making of my career, because she liked people who argued and disagreed with her, and if they could stand their ground. Now, this takes us through, as far as I'm concerned, to just after the election. Frank and I were having dinner in Islington on the Sunday after the second election, and he said, it's a disaster. The papers have all been briefed by Central Office, and there's a putsch on to put Willie Whitelaw in with the agreement of Ted, and that's going to finish Keith. And we agreed. We then rang up Keith, and we said, you need your own man. Can't be us. We're journalists of opinion. We're not reporters. You've got to have your own man in the press gallery whom the press can come to on these occasions. And he says, come round and see me tomorrow morning at the centre. We went round. The door was opened by one of the dazzling Debs who cooked and everything. And we were shown into a room. And Mrs. Thatcher walked in and said, I am Sir Keith's campaign manager. What can I do for you? Well, we know she wasn't a great success as his campaign manager. And in fact, obviously he retreated because he saw what Nigel says quite rightly. I was with Peter Ottley and Frank Moore. We tried to persuade him to stay in, but he said, look, I'm not the kind of metal for the party leader. I'm just not. And Mrs. Thatcher, he said, is. You should transfer your support to her. Well, we did that. The next interesting occasion was when Alfred Sherman invited Mrs. T to a dinner at the Reform Club with Peter Ottley. This was to discuss moving the Daily Telegraph in the right direction. Peter Ottley, Frank, Michael Harrington, our companion, and me. And at the very start of the dinner, Frank said to Mrs. T, what are you going to do after the election result, Mrs. Thatcher? And she said, well, Frank, I shall be leader of the Conservative Party. And he said, no, I mean seriously. And she said, if I didn't think I could win, I wouldn't take it on. I don't do that kind of thing. Well, of course, she turned out to be correct. And again, we were drawn, Frank and I were, so to speak, drawn into the Thatcher world. I remember particularly a lunch with Caroline and Alison, in which I left that lunch feeling I'd been playing table tennis with the world champion when I was a good county player. The rapidity the wit was fantastic, and I realised then exactly why Caroline and Alison were so important in that machine. And it was a kind of a machine, although it was, of course, a very easygoing, old-fashioned machine at one level, but it worked. So I was drawn into. I then became, and this is the way I would put it, Charles. I became a kind of. But Bill Deeds, before in Morris Green, knew.
Bill was the editor of the Telegraph by now.
They knew my opinions, and so they essentially allowed me to be an emissary from the Daily Telegraph to give us, we hope, for scoops and that kind of thing, but we also wanted to influence her. And she came several times to lunches and dinners. So that by the time of the election, 4 years later, she had friends at court and the Telegraph who were well informed, but we were all also ourselves people who were transmitting to her back the ideas that came from, for example, the centre, but also the IEA. The IEA was enormously important in giving her a ready-made set of arguments, and that goes, and she develops that in her relationships with Friedman and Thatcher and other people later. So my own view is the victory of that day, 50 years ago, it was the first big public victory for the radical side in the battle within conservatism that started as early as 1965 with David Howell's pamphlet, Putting Britain Right Ahead, which said many of the Thatcher things then.
Salesman Man.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, Salesman Man and the rest. And then the reverse of that in, I think, 71, with bringing, with the reversal policy, which then led to the party being bitterly divided. It was an extraordinary, lively and interesting period. I don't say brother would never speak to brother. On the contrary, we spoke all the time. We didn't say very nice things. So I think that in retrospect, this was the first big public step towards the Conservative Party becoming what it became in the 1980s.
Thank you. Nigel, you wanted to come in on this.
Well, I thought that having been elected, she was obviously seeking to think what policies should she concentrate on.
Yeah.
And I was digging my pocket just now to bring out one of the early pieces of letterhead of the Centre for Policy Studies. And it's quite interesting to secure the understanding of the methods available to improve the standard of living, quality of life, freedom of choice of British people, with particular attention to social market policies. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the word social meant that she had seen, in fact, I know she had admired Adenauer in Germany, and she said to me that Adenauer and Erhard had created the new Germany, and she said to me that we want less faint hearts and more Erhards. And of course the Germans had built up based on a market based on fairly strong moral grounds. So the social market, I think, rather appealed to her. But along came Shirley Letwin and said, no, Margaret, you don't want to sell a wishy-washy form of capitalism. Drop the word social and go for full-blooded market. Some of us think that might have been a mistake, but anyway, she clearly did that. And her first major thing, of course, was the sale of council houses. And that created a new middle class for Britain. But it's interesting, I think, that Franco, after the last war, instead of building, like Macmillan did here, 300,000 council houses a year, encouraged the creation of 300,000 houses, but let or purchased on very low-cost mortgages so that people owned them. And I think that establishment of ownership in Spain may well have stopped Spain from going socialist, which otherwise it would have done. So contemporary with what Margaret was doing here in England, Frank was doing roughly the same, or had done hitherto there. So I think the comparisons are quite interesting.
It's an important reminder that Nigel's giving there that Joseph and Thatcher were very interested in the social aspects right from the start. It's sometimes considered that all this was dry economics, but it wasn't. William, you wanted to...
Well, I just wanted to make the point that that I'm a firm believer, as a Berlinite, individuals make a difference, there's no question. But there was also a tide in the affairs of men and women at the time. After all, in a sense, who was the first Thatcherite? The abolition of resale price maintenance, which greatly annoyed small shopkeeping families, was Ted's and hated by the Conservative Party at the time. Selsdon Man was a pretty good Howellite. David had a huge influence on it, a free market approach. Then off we went into the inflation crisis and the oil crisis and the coal miners and all that, into a completely different policy led by the effective Deputy Prime Minister, Sir William Armstrong, of a statutory, it wasn't just a statutory prices, incomes and dividends were set by law in the country. Now, it's extraordinary that a Conservative Party could have done that, and there was bound to be a reversion after that. And it was happening elsewhere in the world too, and it was happening else. Peter Jay was writing speeches for Callaghan, remember? Tony Crosland said the party's over. There was beginning to be a shift. Now, there are some who think, and I'm not one of them, that the shift would have happened anywhere in Britain without her. I don't believe that's so, because to actually change the institutions and the directions of the ship took immense strength. But she was riding the right wave. The difficulty in the second part of your discussion this evening is to know what wave the Tory party yes. But so that there were highly intelligent people across the spectrum, actually, and then there is the one other element that I have to say about Ted. Ted, of course, regarded his greatest achievement as taking us into the European Union. And he was extremely suspicious of anybody he thought was at all unsound on Europe. But after that second election, which went quite well, it wasn't a 66 wipeout, provided the basis, incidentally, which Margaret Thatcher was able to defeat Callaghan's government in the House of Commons eventually, with some by-election wins. He thought that he could survive. And this is the one disreputable. I was a loyalist. I was loyal to Alec Douglas Hume. But until I was working for Ted, so I was loyal to him. But the one unattractive side of it was that he didn't really think that Margaret, a woman, he didn't have the high Tory snobbery against her, which some of my friends did, Sir Ian Gilmore and others, but he did sort of feel it'll never be serious with her, and didn't take her.
Because she's a woman.
Partly because she was a woman,
yeah.
and partly he couldn't see her. He hadn't seen her strength. She hadn't been a particularly interesting education secretary. Actually, she followed on with comprehensivisation.
She was very conventional.
She was very conventional.
Yes,
and you were much more interested in, and as I was curious enough, in vouchers and things. And so we were all a bit split. People who'd been loyal to the Ted of Selsdon Man and the 1970 manifesto. I used to go to the IEA with Bill McEwen Younger and things, and it was obviously wrong that a Conservative Party was thinking to run a command economy in that, and it couldn't go on, it had to change.
Could I just come in on that, because I have a slightly different take on aspect of it. As Ted, following the 1971 change of direction, Ted following the defeat in the first election, he moves towards a policy which I would call national government light. It's much more corporatist. There are a desire to bring governments and unions and business into government together, so to speak, to determine economic policy. I was having a conversation with a communist group, which I was involved with because they were sound on Northern Ireland. They were in fact orange communists, right?
Okay.
And in the conversation, their principal theorist said, well, what Ted is doing is bringing about the biggest advance to socialism that this country has ever experienced. So I said, would you be prepared to write that? He said, oh yes. I said, you're saying, let's be clear, that communists should vote for the Tories in this election. He said, oh yes. So I went to Bill Deeds and I said, I have a man who's prepared to advance the communist case for Ted in the Daily Telegraph. And he did. So that's one of my contribution to political theory at that point.
That's lovely. That's lovely. I'm shortly thrown this open to the floor, but I'd like to ask everybody, and particularly you, Alison, this point about the most obvious point about Mrs. Thatcher at that time, that she's the one and only woman in the Conservative Party of any consequence. What did that mean? How did that feel, if it's possible to get back into that situation in 1974, in terms of calculating whether she could be the leader or whether she should be, and what did it feel like, so far as you, Alison, can tell, for her? How did it affect her way of thinking about whether she should be leader, or how she should be leader, how should she win?
I don't think I can put this very eloquently, but from very early on, she was only interested in capabilities and intellect. It didn't make any difference to her. And she wasn't a radical feminist, but she was in some ways the greatest feminist of all, because it was the best man for the job. And it was the best man or the best woman. And that's sort of how it was. I do recall that Ted Heath didn't really engage with her as a friend. He didn't really engage with her as an equal. And
that's true.
as anyone who's read Charles's wonderful book will tell you, when she went out of politeness to tell him that she was going to stand against him, he heard her in silence. And I remember talking to her when she came back, and she said, well, I didn't exactly expect any different. You know, it was how it was. But and in defence of Ted, it wasn't that unusual to think that a woman... we are talking 50 years ago, and it's quite hard for some of you who wouldn't understand. I had no electric typewriter. I mean, everything was manual. I didn't even have a telephone on my desk. You had to go to a little cubbyhole with an attendant. And
when the election was called, the civil service came along and took away my telephone. We had to have another one installed, but which took a week from paid for by central office. It was a different world.
And it is hard to I cannot imagine now how much I would dislike having to do an election campaign with the social media. And, you know, we can't exist without our mobile telephones for 20 minutes. Whereas when, moving on a bit, when I travelled with her, it used to be absolutely heaven sent when the door of the aeroplane shut. So you knew you had 3 or 4 hours before anybody could contact you, during which time half the world could have fallen apart. But William will remember it was absolutely marvellous, a long-haul flight.
Meanwhile, I was trying to write speeches for Ted Heath.
That I was trying to type subsequently.
And then you would hand it to him just as you arrived at Northolt. You'd get on the private plane to go to some great rally somewhere, and you'd hand it back, and there had to be a press notice out within the next 20 minutes. You would hand it back saying, I don't think this is quite right. His only merit was that he would read out my poor jokes. No one would laugh, and then he would say, my private secretary thought that was funny.
We must throw it over, but just very quickly, would any of you admit or remember that you thought, because she's a woman, she shouldn't do it, or that she won't win? Do you think that any of the males here, those thoughts across your mind? Or did you just tend to think she wouldn't win because she was and you wouldn't get to that point?
I have 5 elder sisters, had 5 elder sisters, powerful women. I'd been brought up in a women-dominated environment. I knew that women could run the theatre.
Nigel, did you have a feeling about this, about, gosh, can we, the Tories, have a woman candidate?
Well, I think her whole drive was to increase ownership. And I think she having come from that background, she realised the importance of ownership there and the small businesses. And the legacy she has left as a result of that, I think, is absolutely wonderful. I mean, not only through the ownership of houses, the ownership of shares, in every direction you look, her pensions, her legacy is still with us today. And I think, as I said, that she must have come across that, because it went to the first book we ever published, the quotation from Aristotle, I think it is, where no one owneth, no one careth. And I think that sort of simple moral philosophy drove her, and the end result was the policies that have enfranchised, really, so many of the people in this country today.
Thank you. John, on the woman point, and then we will move on. Yeah.
Well, the woman point is very simple. That I know that and I know that a number of people who were, so to speak, in politics and journalism at that time, on the broadly defined as being on the right, I don't think any of us really thought her being a woman was an obstacle at all. I mean, first of all, we all knew, I mean, we're talking about the 70s here. This was not the 40s, it wasn't the 30s, and that we all knew women in positions of authority. Even going back to being a member of the Federation of the University and Conservative Union, FUCUA, Barbara Turner and Lady Bower Smythe ran the whole thing with, I would say, in retrospect, based on their experience in the wartime army. And so I never felt that for a moment. I did recognize that it might be a problem for some people, and I think, but my own view is that those people were represented very adequately by the 16 votes that went against her, but not for Ted in that first round. It wasn't, in my view, any more a big question in most people's minds. I think the war had a lot to do with that, but other things too, including the women we were marrying or dating and so on, because they were people who'd been to university and expected to have good jobs. Sometimes they didn't always go on to do that for any number of reasons, because they were going to have children and they felt they wanted to devote more time to that. But the fact is, they were there, we knew them, and I think that this was, so to speak, blowing away an aspect of life in Britain which no longer had real force.
Thank you. Now, we very much want to hear Carol, but we will very quickly, I'm sorry to curtail it a bit, but we've talked, I hope you find extremely interestingly, and I'll just get 2 or 3 questions from the floor. I see Lord Roberts of Belgravia over there. A microphone, a microphone is coming, please.
How important was Airy Neve in Margaret Thatcher's victory?
Airy Neve was critical.
Yes. I might just say myself on that, because actually nobody here was in the House of Commons at this point, and perhaps it's something we should have said, that this leadership election was purely MPs voting, and therefore very different atmosphere from what has subsequently happened. And the question was, you know, a lot of admiration for Margaret among MPs, but could they believe in a woman? How annoyed with Ted were they? And could there be somebody in the sort of middle of the Conservative Party backbenches of sufficient weight to sway opinion? And that turned out to be Airy Neve. And he had a very clever technique about this, which is, he did all the usual things like saying, you know, I don't know why Ted has never offered you a job. You know, it's so obvious that Margaret would, you know, recognise your talents, that sort of thing. But those are fairly standard techniques. But he wanted to convey to everyone that she was doing well, but not too well, because what he understood was that there were a lot of MPs who wanted to get rid of Heath without necessarily wanting her to succeed. And so he put the story about that she was there, but she was nearly there, but not there enough. because he wanted them to think, well, this is our only chance to get rid of Heath, and then they can think all the other thoughts they might have, like, good, but once she's got rid of Heath, we'll put in Willie White, or whoever it might be. And so it was a sort of accidental coalition, if you like, of people who either wanted Mrs. Thatcher positively or didn't want Heath, or both.
I think all the white lawyers voted for her on the first ballot and thereby killed their own man.
Yes, yes. Something similar happened with James Cleverly votes this time, didn't that? Got all in a terrible muddle.
And Ted's campaign, we had two PPSs, long-standing Tim Kitson, splendid Yorkshire farmer, and Kenneth Baker joined ebulliently later on, and we had lists, and they were pretty hopeless. And Ted was hopeless. He would say, "There's a group of MPs there, Ted. I think, you know, if you went and spoke to them, we might be able to sing. They're all old friends." Well, Ted, they might want to have been old friends, but would you go and speak to them again? No. It was just hopeless. And we had lists in which we had, I bet Airy had the same, but we had a list, an elite list of people who we thought would promise to everybody.
Yeah. There definitely were.
Archie Hamilton, Lord Hamilton of Epsom, who was Mrs. Thatcher's PPS at a later date.
Can I follow up on Airy and Eve? The
Yeah.
marriage made in heaven was between Airy and Margaret. And the reason for that was that Airy and Eve had been organising a complete campaign to elect Edward Buchan.
Yeah.
And Edward Buchan's problem was, and I think we can now talk about it, he borrowed £600,000, which is quite a lot of money in those days, to invest in a very speculative company in Canada which went bust. And the result was he was in serious financial difficulty and he had to stand down as a candidate. So Airy was left with no candidate. And Margaret thought that Keith Joseph should lead the party and he stood down. And so she said, well, if he's not going to stand, I will. And Margaret was left with no organisation whatsoever and no ability to build up an organisation either, because I'm afraid, much as I admire in every conceivable way, managing the parliamentary party was not one of her strong points. And Airy and Eve gave her the organisation, and he actually played a critical role in making sure that she was elected.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I don't think we need to add to that brilliant summary. Is that Andrew Robertson there, I think? Yes. Microphone.
I can shout.
I
often do. I don't think you're going to cover this in the second bit after the commercial break, but what analogies can you draw with the current situation, and what lessons should we draw from 50 years ago?
Let's do that very quickly, please. Nigel, what analogies with the current situation, what lessons?
The power behind the throne is very important in all directions, I think. The having a core central policy that strikes at the very heart of most voters, such as ownership, I think that's the primary lesson I would remember from her reign.
Alison.
Primary. This is a bit above my pay grade, Charles. You know that. I was a very, very small cog in the wheel. And although I'm one of the people who was privileged to know John in those days, but I wasn't one of the people who you referred to, who you could speak to on even remotely level terms on account of the fact that I had not been to university. I didn't even have any A-levels because I left school and learnt to type. But I'm glad I did, and I'm very proud to be here today, but I think it's way above my level to talk about the present administration as opposed to how it was.
Well, it's very sweet of you, but you say you were a cog in the small cog in the wheel, but undoubtedly the wheel would not have turned without your... William, the lessons... one of them anyway.
I think that conservatism in Britain works best when we get that magical balance between our version of Edward Burke and our version of Adam Smith. Free enterprise and property owning, but a sense of community and nationhood as well. And not being frightened of the big dangerous thing. Perhaps part of the job of a democratic politician is to recognise that there are dangerous things about always and to take them and channel them in the right way. There's a real feeling out there at the moment that they've all been let down, that nobody's any good, you know, that there's nobody to trust. It's a dangerous stuff, that, because it can end in horrible things. Take that and build that back into a proper party again.
John?
I think just two things. One is, I think, Alison, you are greatly underestimating your what you did. But you were a key
I'm
member.
not a politician. I never was. I didn't begin to understand.
Well, that's part of your attraction. But the second one is this. I think the lesson of her career as a whole, but also of this particular episode, is the Conservative leader must never either dislike or despise or keep at bay the ordinary members of the party. There's got to be an honest relationship. That will sometimes mean a leader will have to ask them, the people in the party, to trust them. They're doing something that maybe he's doing something they are suspicious of. But if he or she has built up a reservoir of trust, as Mrs. Thatcher did, so that when, for example, she had to turn down David Howell's suggestion of a battle with the miners in '81, they knew already that it wasn't because of cowardice or timidity or because she had, or because of any political reason like that. It was the sheer practical question of, well, what she said to Frank that night: I don't take on battles that I know I can't win. I take on the battles and I win them. And I think that she had, that the party as a whole, in Parliament and in the country, was loyal to her because she had shown again and again before those kind of occasions that she was on their side. And that hasn't always been what Conservative leaders have done.
Thank you. Before we call on Carol, can we just express our appreciation for this marvellous panel, which I think has really Thank you all. I'm delighted to see, I'm very delighted that Carol's here. I'm delighted to see her sitting with Dean, because Dean and she share a distinction, which actually quite a lot of other people have too, which is they both were sacked by Max Hastings. Carol, please come and address us. Come up to the lectern and say whatever you want to say.
Now, I don't know if this works, but I inherited a very strident voice from you-know-who, so it may not matter. Lords Moore, Godson, marvellous panel, marvellous audience. I'd like to add one small thing to what has already been said, and that is my mother was nicknamed the Iron Lady, and she took great pleasure and pride in living up to that name whenever it was necessary. I once came out of number 10 and I got in a black cab, and the driver said, "Hello, Carol," and then he said, "I picked someone up the other day outside Downing Street, Whitehall." He said, "Been in to see her, he had. Still shaking, he was." For several of the years my mother was leader of the opposition, I actually lived in Australia. But I was not out of the loop. You see, I had pen pal Maggie. My mother found the time and the inclination to write to me long, newsy letters of what her life was like. So I had a snapshot of behind the scenes. Today, on this very special anniversary, I've been allowed to do a few excerpts. Let's start, first of all, the revolving door of politics, the reshuffle. Dear Carol, I don't yet know what reshuffling to do among the number 2s in shadow cabinet. A few changes need to be made. Bringing them in is not the difficulty, it's who to get out that causes the problems. Somehow I shall have to strengthen the financial team. Brain power is not enough. You need personality and impact as well. Quite so. The political battle from 75, the road to number 10. Darling, next week is much quieter because I haven't got the number of outside speeches of previous weeks. But I suspect more attacks on us will materialise. Still, it's good training for what will doubtless be a very bitter election campaign. Oh, she evolved, and I love to hear, she evolved as leader of the opposition from the moment she got the job. Carrying on, at the Ilford by-election, one journalist was heard talking about me. We have to stop that woman at any price. I thought it was quite a compliment. My mother was a very reluctant holiday maker. Al, help me here, yes? A very reluctant holiday maker.
She longed for a telephone call to say there's a world crisis.
Darling Carol, we're going to stay with some friends in Switzerland. They've got loads of bankers coming for dinner so we can have a proper, in-depth debate on the world economy. My father's reaction to this is not mentioned. At this very same Swiss villa, I have had on authority, she was found, as Al has just said, to be looking outside enthusiastically for the motorbike to arrive with the red box. One year, in opposition, they went, at the invitation of a fellow parliamentary colleague, sailing off Devon and Cornwall. Mum wrote, "It's very pleasant, but the press are moving around everywhere and I can't go ashore because it's just like doing a walkabout." Then the British weather came to her rescue. In Sulcombe, it poured with rain, so I was able to go ashore, very well disguised in oilskins and a large sou'wester, which practically covered my face completely. Next in the letter, you can't take the grocer's daughter out of the seafaring Maggie. We've come across quite a number of other MPs with boats. We're beginning to feel quite deprived. More careful housekeeping from Mrs. T. I went up to the Crown Derby factory to buy the office and other people Christmas gifts. The chairman was there, so I got a staff discount. Thank goodness, because the prices have gone up quite a lot. Now we get to number 10. And she wrote, this was written, do anyone remember those old blue air letter forms? You folded them up, and then you licked around the edge. Whatever. We made some changes in the flat. I got tired of the shout. This is the days when the Prime Minister lived over number 10 and didn't swap around with number 11, which is a bigger flat. I got fed up of the very shabby furniture that we had, and I heard that there were 3 flats in Admiralty House that weren't being used, so I went on a tour of inspection. As a result, our shabby furniture is going to go there to gather dust. And some of their better stuff is going... So I had visions of sort of removal people trotting across Horsecar's Bay. Wonderful, excellent. So, continue. Without spending any money, underlined, we've improved the place no end. Ladies and gentlemen, improved the place no end. What my mother did to this country from 1979 to 1990. And to be here today, Charles, is extremely special. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Is it all in here? Yes. Yes. There ends part 1, and we now have the intermission. And thank you, Carol, for just wonderful. The flavour of the letters. I was greatly privileged when I wrote to discover a whole load of early letters that she wrote to your aunt, her sister. They're just marvellous, and they have this lovely, direct, tart way of talking, which is just so characteristic. Thank you so much. We will now break, and we need to eat and drink, and for that purpose, we need to clear the gangway down there, please, because that's where we will gather. Thank you all very much. See you soon.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Start from here. I'm Paul Goodman, and I will be chairing this next session on lessons of 1975, that is assuming there are any, given the gulf in time and circumstances, and assuming, secondly, that we can discern what they are. I'll wrap it up after about an hour. Our panel is going to speak for about 5 or 7 minutes each, and then it will be over to you for questions and discussion. I will keep the introductions very brief, but we've got a marvellous panel here. And I'm going to start by asking Katie Lam, MP for Weald of Kent, to speak to us about lessons of 1975. Katie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you so much for having me this evening. I wanted to start by saying how much I enjoyed the first panel. That was such an exciting time for our party, and it's fascinating to hear it brought so vividly to life. There's so much that we can take from this period when we look ahead and think about the future. But I believe the most important lesson is this. Margaret Thatcher won the 1975 Conservative Party leadership contest, and in my view, won the 1979 general election because she, more than anyone else, understood where the country was, what was wrong, and what was needed to fix it. And she had the clarity, the talent, and the drive to do something about it, and the public believed that too. All that might sound obvious, but you don't actually need that to win an election or even a landslide. In 1997, Tony Blair won his historic victory, guided instead by an electoral fact that Labour had to reach the growing and new middle classes to win office. Thatcher's starting point was a philosophical, ideological, even moral assessment of Britain in the 1970s. And she deserves great credit for seeing plainly what many other politicians of the day, experienced and intelligent though they may have been, failed to see, which is, to borrow a phrase from our current Conservative Party leader, the system isn't working. Thatcher got that Britain needed to return to the set of principles and ideas that made it great, principles and ideas that, for a long time, the Conservative Party upheld, embodied, fought for. That's what she campaigned and won on in 1975. In fact, it was almost all she campaigned on. There was no policy. Even by 1979, there wasn't much policy. But the concepts were crystal clear. Speaking in Finchley in January 1975, Thatcher succinctly laid out the traditional ideas of Toryism: compassion and concern for the individual and his freedom, opposite to excessive state power, the right of the enterprising, the hard-working and the thrifty to succeed, to reap the rewards and to pass some of them on to their children. So she started from first principles, she had an overall diagnosis, and then she was canny, she was tactical, she was patient. It's easy to remember Thatcher, I think, at the peak of her powers, at her most sort of strident and uncompromising. But her first decision in government was to accept the high public sector pay recommendations of the Clegg Commission. She rightly judged that she needed to in order to avoid strikes for which she wasn't ready. But she also understood that the moment tactics become an end in themselves, the goal rather than the means of politics, then you might as well not bother. So that basic approach, clear principles, correct diagnosis, effective tactics, was successful then, and I think if we're talking about lessons for the future, would be successful now. I think our new leader feels that way too, and that's why she takes the approach that she does. Of course, so much is different today. The country and the Conservative Party are facing very different challenges now than we were then. And if Margaret Thatcher were around today, she'd be the first to point this out. She would be looking to learn from history, but she would know that whilst there are lessons in history books, in Lord Moore's excellent biographies, that's different from answers. She would be reading extensively about the root causes of our slow growth, about mass migration, energy and climate, the planning system, the emerging scientific and technological revolution, public sector productivity, Russia, China and Iran. She'd be meeting and quizzing the best, all in service of working out how to apply and uphold the Tory ideals she cherished: freedom, enterprise, family, compassion, to today's Britain. I'm afraid we Conservatives must also have the clarity, humility and bravery to see that the electoral situation we find ourselves in is also very different. The situation Kemi has inherited is much trickier than the one that Thatcher did. In 1975, the Conservative Party had no challenge on its home turf, had no Reform Party to contend with, and there were just 13 rather than 72 Liberals in Parliament. And the world has changed. The pace of everything is faster. Everyone's attention spans have shortened, as has the political cycle, dramatically, in fact. But I do think so much of what she can achieve then can inspire us now. As Boris Johnson did in 2019, Thatcher showed us in the 1975 contest, and for well over a decade beyond it, that we don't have to choose between being sensible and radical. We don't have to choose between advancing our principles and being in the real common ground of British public opinion. We don't have to choose between being sound or one nation. Thatcher showed us these are all false choices. As Lord Moore documents so clearly, and contrary to popular myth, the 1975 contest was no coup, neither for provincial upstarts nor for hard right-wingers. Thatcher's ascendancy then, and her victories in 79 and 83 and 87, were built on her belief that one could, and in fact one had to, hold the right and the centre, both of the Tory party and the country, at the same time. Her first move as leader wasn't to call Enoch Powell, it was to offer Ted Heath shadow foreign secretary and make Willie Whitelaw her deputy and put Ian Gilmore amongst other moderates in her shadow cabinet. And what was true for personnel was true for style and principles and policy. With a sort of half-awake, half-zealot Labour government, a Liberal party content to be super councillors and not much more, and Reform strong on problems but lighter on solutions, the Conservative Party can, it must, become the party of both the right and the centre in Britain again today. The party of dynamic, world-class public services, but also of a small state and low taxes, of strong borders and of compassion, of cheap energy and of a vibrant natural environment. We can, as Thatcher did, build out, surely, steadily, but decisively, in both directions at the same time.
Thank you, Katie. Our next speaker on the panel is Baroness Moyer, who is a very distinguished global economist. Just I thought before I let you in 1975, as we were hearing earlier, there was a division about economics on the right. There was a large group of people in the Conservative Party, the sort of establishment, who believed in prices and incomes policy, the approach that Ted Heath had taken later in the 70 to 74 Parliament. It's also true today, there are quite significant differences on bits of the right about economic policy. You've now got a school who believe quite actively in industrial policy and those who don't. And obviously, there's the discussion about protection and free trade, which has suddenly become enormously topical. So with those few words of introduction, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for including me. Dean, thank you for the invitation and policy exchange. I actually had the honor of having lunch with Baroness Thatcher at the Goring just a few months before her death. And it was myself and an additional friend. And actually have subsequently been given a gift of one of her scarves, which was won at auction, which I cherish to this day. I view my contribution here and my comments here to be largely about economics, and hopefully will be distinctive in that respect, because I know the other panelists here will have a much broader perspective and understanding of, for example, Lord Moore here about Margaret Thatcher's legacy. Specifically, let me say off the bat that I admired Margaret Thatcher, and still do today, for two fundamental reasons. One is that she articulated a clear economic vision of small government, burgeoning private sector, free markets and free people, which I think is important to remember from a historical context, would have last been seen in practice in the Gilded Age. Certainly theoretically, the Industrial Revolution, Adam Smith in books, it was sort of well known, but as a practical experiment, she really was, she delivered on an ideology, an economic ideology that was really supported and catalyzed by failings, what she saw as failings and weakness in the public sector, but broadly in the economy. The second thing I think I only grow more of admiration for her on is that she achieved and ended up in the top position in British politics. And I don't say that just because she's a woman or was a woman or a class outsider, but as someone who patently had a different economic ideology to the consensus of the day. I think about, and I look forward to wider discussion here. I think, in a way, it might have been easier to have the consensus, Ted Heath, keep pursuing the sort of standard policies, but to be a rank outsider and to propose avant-garde policies, I think sets her apart. The other point I think really worth stressing is that Margaret Thatcher set in motion fundamental and structural change, not just in Britain, but was ultimately an architect of change that remodeled the world economy. And I worry, being here in this event, but more generally, people don't fully recognize what she did in terms of catalyzing change around the world. What we today know as the Washington Consensus obviously was a term coined in 1989 by John Williamson, but really it was an articulation of a number of ideas that Margaret Thatcher had espoused. Smaller government, lower taxes, thinking about privatization, fiscal discipline, public spending that needed to be curbed, trade liberalization, and we'll obviously get to that given the general backdrop today. It's also very important to remember that globally, these policies, so this doctrine, basically drove world global growth GDP terms for an increase of about 2.5 times, from about $44 trillion in GDP, world GDP in 1980, to over $100 trillion by the time of the 2008 financial crisis. Today, for reference, the world economy is at about 160 trillion, but very skewed to the United States and China. In a similar vein, according to the Office of National Statistics, in the United Kingdom, GDP grew from 260 billion in 1980 to roughly 1.6 trillion in 2008, a 6-time increase. And there's no doubt about it, whether a historian, economist, that this is really driven largely by the policies and the vision that Margaret Thatcher had espoused. In terms of per capita income, Britain went from just under 19,000 in 1980 to 35,000 per capita in 2008, which is a near doubling. So for 50 years later, I should say 50 years later, here we are today, globalization does have its discontents. It is clear today, and I think we need to be honest about the fact that a lot of the gains to globalization in trade, capital flows, movement of people, ideas, multilateralism, have really accrued to capital and not to labor. And I won't go through data here, but we're very familiar with the fact that real wages, particularly after 2010, stagnated or declined in many countries around the world, including here. And I think that the key takeaway, I think if Baroness Thatcher were here, I think that looking back on 50 years, there would have to be some acknowledgement that public policy has had a blind spot about how technology and economics are not just drivers of social change, but they also can drive political change, geopolitical changes, and cultural changes, which you've all seen. And whether those economic changes manifest in real wage declines, issues around populism that we're seeing now, and in a strange way, sort of a boomerang towards nationalism and deglobalization, which is what we're dealing with now, I think that's going to be an important lesson for people like myself who still believe in the kernels and the foundation of free markets and free people, but there has to be a recognition that we need to think more strategically about what about, in terms of the costs and the artifacts of some of these policies that no doubt have moved hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It was mentioned in the opening comments that we are in a different world, and although I am still euphoric about fundamentally giving people the opportunity to make choices about how they spend their time, the decisions they make in public policy, but also the decisions they make in their own personal lives, I think a few of these fundamental changes, structural changes that are occurring are worth repeating. Demographic shifts, age dependency. I mean, here we are today, 2025. There are 9 million Brits who have not returned to work after the pandemic. This is a real fundamental problem we need to address. We're living in a world of every nation for itself. I think there's no doubt about it. The implications of the re-election of President Trump are going to put a fine tune our need to come up with real policies that are realistic, not emotional. It doesn't matter how we feel about the individual. The fact of the matter is that we are going to be affected in terms of trade, and whether it's directly or through second-order effects, we have to be realistic about that. Super cycle, you touched on not just AI and climate. I think it's worth also thinking about the era of Margaret Thatcher's sort of ascendancy into political power. That period was really quite transformative about these ideas and ideals of globalization. The wall came down in 1989, 2001, China joins the WTO. All these things were incredibly catalytic in terms of driving economic growth and moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But we're now, since that period, we haven't had other super cycles that could really drive and change the global economy. And we're now at the beginning of arguably two big ones. And how we actually catalyze and use those new super cycles will be very interesting. I would like to just leave off with a couple of last minute points. The other thing we need to think about, not just AI, not just demographics, not just about deglobalization, is about the role of the state. And this is an age-old debate, and we're not going to solve it here. But I think it's unrealistic in the backdrop of AI for us to not recognize that the nature and the role of state is going to have to change. I don't want to open Pandora's box here about exactly what that may look like, but suffice it to say, with hundreds of millions of jobs forecast to be lost, and basically further gains are likely to accrue to a smaller proportion of the population. I think we do need to have a debate about what the world looks like in that sense. Let me just conclude by saying I do remain optimistic, and I think aspects of government efficiency, I think we should all be euphoric and hopeful that the combination of a risk-loving and avant-garde president like Trump with Elon Musk and his team, who are operational experts, but also the advent of technology, that combination, let's all be optimistic that that can actually generate government efficiency improvements. If they don't, I can't think of a combination that will be able to succeed, and there have been previous attempts. But I would like to just end off by saying the following point about Margaret Thatcher. With all the noise, and whether it's our attention spans are lower, there's a lot of change in the media landscape, I think perhaps one of the most impressive things about Margaret Thatcher was the rigor with which she approached these questions around public policy. And it may have been a result of her scientific background as a chemist. I actually also have a scientific background as a chemist, so I would like to attach myself to her glory. But on a serious note, her policies were built on firm evidence. And this is something I feel is missing. Too much ideology, not enough evidence. And I'll just leave you with a comment that was made by Mike Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York. He said, ultimately, public policy should be quite simple, because if policymakers are driven by four things, then they should be able to execute at the highest level. And those things are being data-driven, focused on measured outcomes, forward-leaning, so looking and thinking about the future, and avoiding corruption. And I think it's a very simple list, but I think really Margaret Thatcher embodied all of that. Thank you.
And third, we have Ross Kempsell, former head of the Conservative Research Department, now translated, if that's quite the right way of thinking it, into the Supremo of Guido Fawkes.
Yeah.
Ross.
Thanks, Paul. I first of all should just say thank you, Dean, for inviting me. I was reflecting in that first panel that we heard on all of the personal anecdotes, the moments that we heard about from the very distinguished panel recounting their experiences with Lady Thatcher, and I was thinking that nobody else but Policy Exchange could have put together such a fascinating and insightful, discussion. And I was also reflecting that as young Conservatives now, although I'm not a frontline politician, far from it, as young Conservatives now, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and we are privileged to be able to build on Lady Thatcher's legacy. In my own background as a director of the Conservative Research Department, which in the time when she was leader of the Conservative Party prior to her entering Downing Street was actually based just a few buildings away from here on Old Queen Street. There was a seriousness about that operation which I think we can learn from afresh today. And it was embodied in Lady Thatcher's diligence and the way that she led the Conservative Party with an extremely strong strain of seriousness about understanding and knowing her brief. We often talk and reflect about her being very passionate and being a politician who led from the front with her instinctive beliefs, but my goodness, did she do the hard work that was required to lead and to make change in British politics. She, it's said, if you read histories of the Conservative Research Department, many of them have actually been written or contributed to or reviewed by people in this room. One of the first memories David Cameron has of being a young Conservative researcher, I think director of the political section, he met Lady Thatcher for the first time, and she quizzed him immediately in detail on that day's trade figures. Lord Cameron, my noble colleague, I'm so sorry to relate to you, struggled to recount the precise details of the various facts and figures that Margaret Thatcher required of him. And he reflects that that moment never left him as a young Tory researcher, and it shaped his own approach to always knowing and understanding the facts of what he was talking about. And of course that was reflected in the tone that Lady Thatcher took in the House of Commons as leader of the Conservative Party, debating with the Labour government in its last years of incumbency, because she made it very clear in those exchanges that there was no longer a casual consensus between the two major parties, so much of which I think was, I'm afraid, summed up with what can probably be termed as a kind of boys' club approach to politics. She broke through that with a seriousness, a Stakhanovite work ethic, taking her leadership seriously and holding the government of the day to account. I think there's an additional factor which is important for us to reflect on now, and I suppose my colleagues outlined so many of the ways in which the world has changed, but it's the Conservative Party after all, and there are also many things that have stayed the same since that leadership election. And one of them, I think, is the sense in which the Conservatives always have a vulnerability. They assume that because of the fullness of time and the organic development of events, they will somehow defeat Labour again, because Labour will prove itself to have been economically incompetent, and inside that is a kind of complacency. And I think the Conservatives face the same challenge today. I think there is very little evidence to assume that the Conservatives will, just because of the passage of time, recover their political position in the current environment. They require action. They require the kind of leadership the model of leadership that Lady Thatcher shows us, where she was unafraid to put forward her platform, yes, with diligence and with accuracy, but also with a large amount of powerful activity. And the Conservatives, I'm afraid, need to do that again. They can't assume that just because Keir Starmer is having a very difficult time of it at the moment, the Conservatives will somehow recover a divine right to govern. It isn't going to happen. without a lot of hard work from the Conservative Party, and I think that's always been the way. Maybe a closing reflection is not only the degree of leadership that she displayed in that crucial moment of bringing the Conservatives back into government, but its legacy over the following decades. After Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, of course, the Conservatives the Labour Party wouldn't form a majority government again at a general election until 1997. And they didn't win the majority of seats at a national election of any kind until the European elections in 1989. So her victory had a long tail and a significant impact that inspired generations of Conservatives to come. And I think, I would say this, wouldn't I, but we need to look at 2019 as that model for the Conservatives again. It was a model that was right for that year and that time, and there are many things that can be said in positives and negatives about what came after in that government. But it was a coalition that the Conservatives formed that was eventually similar to the coalition that Lady Thatcher went on to build. She didn't straight away, but it took time, and the Conservatives widened their appeal, uniting non-traditional Conservative voters with the Conservative base, and that's exactly the map that we need to learn from again.
Charles, we'll just bring you in on that last point. Devil's advocate question, are there really lessons from 75 given the huge changes in the landscape? I mean, the debate in the first part of these proceedings was all about the economies, incomes policy, money supply, what do you do about the trade unions? Now the debate is much more infested with culture and the consequences of mass immigration and all that. And we're not members of the European Union, and you don't necessarily feel America has your back. So that's part of the consideration. And then there's the element that Ross was talking about, which is, if there is a recovery on the right, why should it come from the Conservatives? I mean, William Waldegrave pointed out on the panel in the first part of the discussion that Ted Heath left quite a good situation after October 74, nearly won. Margaret Thatcher was in a position to come in 79, and the Conservatives are down to 121 seats, have been through goodness knows how many leaders. And, as a member of the party, I have to say we didn't distinguish ourselves greatly in government. So, there's the challenge. What do you think about all that?
First of all, to take the last point first, the challenge from the right, it's true, is a big thing now and was not a big thing then. And that was partly reflected in party structure, so that it was very much a two-party system, and now you could almost say it's a six-party system right now, and that makes a massive difference. But I'm not so sure and certainly are massive changes in the subject matter, but they're not quite as great as you say. So actually the economic questions are absolutely vital, and it's clear that neither side has thought about them for a long time. And this is precisely what we're discovering with this government, that we thought in all these years of opposition they perhaps had thought about them, and perhaps they did have some idea about the revival of growth and so on, and actually it really doesn't seem to be the case that they have thought about it. They've assumed that Tories were bad and they would win and it would be all right. And I think what they thought was, we will immediately defy our own left by showing how serious we are about the public finances, getting them in balance, not recognising that public finances are only one aspect of economic policy, and the rest of it is all to do with incentive, opportunity. So actually they've sort of managed to target bomb everybody who might be able to create more wealth and terrify and depress everybody. What I think, a couple of things that can be learnt from the Thatcher example, perhaps summed up in something she said. I think she said it to John Hoskins, who was so important in helping her make policy. And she said early on, I know what, you tell me how. So what she means is, I've got a series of beliefs, and I'm not really going to change those beliefs. But any old fool can have beliefs. The question is, how do you make your beliefs operative, or as people now put it, how do you weaponize your beliefs? And that I think she was extremely serious about, and and determined. And she did herself a disservice, really, or perhaps it was a necessary disservice, but she said she always wanted everyone to think she was a conviction politician, and this was true. But the world is full of conviction politicians, and they're tremendous bores. They just go on saying whatever they think. The question is, what's the relationship between conviction and action? And you need the convictions, all right, but how does it issue in action? And she was deeply interested in that. I don't think she was very good at actual detailed policy, though she knew everything about policy. But she inspired people to work this through. And though we talk constantly about her, and rightly in a way, we mustn't underrate the capacity which she showed early on, and her diminished in this later, is using other able people to make. So the Conservative Party, she was able to activate wide swathes of it. So particularly important in the 70s and in the early and mid-80s was, of course, Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson. And Geoffrey Howe was never on the right of the party, though he was a free marketeer. And she was, I don't think her personal relationship was all that good, because you could never forget, even from the beginning, that he had stood against her in the second ballot. And sometimes after he'd sort of annoyed her and he then left the room, she'd say 19 votes, which I think is what he got in the leadership election. So it was always sort of at the back of her mind. But Richard Ryder had a brilliant phrase, which is that Geoffrey was the tapestry master of Thatcherism, the person who could work it all out, work it through, and in a mild, persuasive sort of way rather than an aggressive way. And Nigel Lawson was the sort of bold original of Thatcherism and intellectually stronger than Mrs. T, and she recognised that, and it all worked very well for a long time, and of course it all ended in grief, but not until many, many years of success. And so, and this, you need to think it right through, and I think because she had the convictions, this made her avoid certain mistakes that some other people might. So if she was asked a sort of straight question about belief, she would always have an answer to it. So for example, to take a modern example, when Keir Starmer was asked what a woman was, he couldn't say. And then he had to sort of think afterwards and work it out and qualify it and so on. And Mrs. Thatcher would not have had that problem. Admittedly, she wouldn't have been asked that question either, but nevertheless. So that's there. And the example of that, I would say, which is sort of equivalent to this in the economic terms, was very early on in Brown Walden interview, just after she'd become Prime Minister, I think. There's a rather good play about it, just on the television recently. He said, "You're against equality. You don't believe in equality, do you?" And she said, "You're right, I don't." The reason I don't is, and so she emphasised the need of personal choice and, of course, opportunity. So her idea about people who are in a poor way is they need to be assisted to gain opportunity rather than trying to achieve an equal. We're talking really here about economic opportunity, not other forms of opportunity. And there's a sort of boldness in saying that, which then opens up a whole range of policy. But don't believe Mrs. Thatcher's account that she's always doing something very brave and daring all the time, because she's only doing that sometimes. So sometimes she's being incredibly cautious. So, for example, the word privatisation, which probably in the world made her more famous than any other word, didn't pass her lips until about 1982. And it wasn't in the manifesto except in 79, except in very, very sort of marginal terms, selling off, I think, the shares of BP and one or two other things. So the idea is there, the germ is there, because you know what the convictions are, but then there's the how do you work it out? And the other aspect of this is the readiness to challenge orthodoxy, but the cautiousness about how and when to do that. So people have almost forgotten this now, but the dominant economic theory of the time when she became leader was prices and incomes policy. And this was all about how to control inflation and how to control wages and strikes. And people really thought you had to do that by having a so-called prices and incomes policy. That otherwise, how would it all spin out of control? And it had to be sort of adjudicated by beer and sandwiches at number 10 and sort of boards who worked out what the right price and the right... and this was essentially rubbish, really. I mean, it wasn't 100% nonsense, because you have to worry about particularly public sector wages and so on, but nevertheless it was wrong. And there are other ways of doing these things. And so, step by step, and John Hoskins used the phrase stepping stones, you work out how to change this. So you change the policy about the control of money, and you reform the laws about trade unions. And you learn from the mistake. Heath tried to do that, but did it by the criminal law, and she did it by the civil law, which is a stronger means. And therefore, it's not always, and again, this is a bit of a Thatcher myth created partly by her, it's not always confrontation. Sometimes it's confrontation, but also it's quite sort of crab-like progress. And so an interesting fact about Mrs. Thatcher, which shows that it wasn't all division and bitterness and sort of bloodshed, is that when she came into office in 1979, there were 29.6, I think, million working days lost to strikes. And when she left office in 1990, there were 1.8 million working days lost to strikes. So what you actually have is harmony. You don't normally associate that word with Margaret Thatcher, but you have industrial harmony to a fantastic degree, utter transformation. And there's a sort of element of patience there and concentration. And the final thing I'd say about that is that I think it applies to world affairs. Mrs. Thatcher was an ignoramus in world affairs when she began, and she became astute in world affairs, and she moved from a, I think largely correctly, hawkish position about the Soviet Union to being almost too much the other way. It's almost a friend of Gorbachev, perhaps putting too much faith in Gorbachev. But that shows an interesting sense of how the world's changed, and her capacity to ally with Reagan on this, though they had very different emphases about things like nuclear weapons. But fundamentally, again, they have the same basic conviction, and they then find a way through it to... So the Cold War was won by Thatcher and Reagan, and actually I would also say that she would hate me to say this, with Helmut Kohl as well. And this shows a sort of concentration on the subject, and a way of thinking it through, which is actually given to few politicians. And now, just to apply those to now, I think, what are the orthodoxies to question? One, I think, is net zero, and I say net zero rather than climate change. I think, I'm not saying that climate change is not an important question. I think it's extraordinary that everyone voted for net zero, or was about 5 MPs who didn't. And it's wrong, because it's essentially arbitrary, and it's proposing a series of actions which are not justified, that nobody's worked out the effect of their costs. Nobody's worked out what it means if we do it but nobody else does, and so on. And you have to be pretty brave at the key juncture to say no to this, because nobody could say no to prices and incomes policy in the 70s. They just sort of couldn't, except Enoch Powell did actually. But Tories had a slight go at it early on and then gave up on it, and went in for it, and so on. And I think another one, which actually is, the dam is breaking, is on what people, I don't like the word, I can never think of the right word there, but is to do with wokery. So it now does already look mad that people took the knee after the death of George Floyd. It looks mad. I mean, it was a horrible thing that happened, but why did the death of one man at the hands of the Minneapolis policeman mean that people all over the world had to take the knee? It's crazy, and it's also dangerous, because perhaps it's a social media phenomenon, because we were sort of ambushed to do it. So you came under tremendous pressure if you refused to do it, and it happened at universities, and it happened in the civil service, and it happened in football teams, and Keir Starmer did it, Andrew Rayner did it, and then you sort of suddenly find actually you can question it, or sometimes you can get the good bit out of change and question the other bit. So I think most people in the room would agree that the emancipation of lesbians and gays is basically a good thing in British society. There are lots of arguments inside that, but basically. But why was the T stuck on the end? Why did everyone agree that the T should be stuck on the end of LBG? Why is T the same as LGB? And again, we sort of accepted a doctrine about this without actually really thinking what we were doing. And then it all becomes later. People start to see that's very funny and then very strange. And then, not that transgender people don't need respect and freedom and so on, but look what happened with Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon and all that, and suddenly everybody realises this is a bit crazy. And the capacity to put up a hand and say, wait a moment, is a very important political gift. And Conservatives are very good when they do that, but they're not very good when they get all bitter and twisted and rude about it. And one of the things that I think has happened, and it's a sort of, it's almost, again, it's a social media thing, is people just thinking because they've said something very stridently that they've achieved something. And actually, it's often pretty horrible and pretty negative, and also they don't know what they're talking about. That's another of the problems. But I think I just say finally about Kemi Badenoch that I think obviously she says he patronisingly got a massive amount to learn, and that was true of Mrs. Thatcher in 1975. She was not very good in many ways in 1975, and she had the essential qualities were all there. She wasn't very good at question time in House of Commons. She was easily nonplussed by the greater sort of wit and flexibility of Callaghan and Wilson, and of course the experience that they had. People said she was too shrill, sort of inflexible, couldn't get the right tone, partisan, etc. Kemi Badenoch comes in with a reputation for, as people say, crossing the road to pick a fight, which is, she's very brave in a fight, and that's good, but you shouldn't cross the road for it. You should have the fight only when you have to have it. I think she's already realised that. And I think the fact that we're not hearing a great deal from her right now is a good thing, in my opinion. And she's under great pressure for that to be different, because she's supposed to counter not only the government, but reform. But I think it's worth a bit of a wait in order to let reform shout their heads off, and then you know what you're talking about when you come in and hit back. So I'll end there.
Okay, we started a bit late. We've probably got about 20 minutes. What I will do is take 2 questions at a time, with Dean's reminder flashing up in front of me, which is name and organisation when asking a question, please, exclamation mark. So who wants to go first? Silence. No, I can see a hand there, and then Harry Phipps. So there, yeah.
Ian Morling. Charles mentioned stepping stones. In fact, it started with a wiring diagram which Hoskins produced in 1974. And when Margaret Thatcher saw it, she said it looks like a chemical works, but she loved it. And from that, with Alfred Sherman, and Charles, you said you were going to mention Alfred Sherman, they produced, well, in fact, it was Hoskins and Norman Strauss produced the Stepping Stones document, which is extraordinary. And don't we need to do a Stepping Stones today? And Hoskins was not a politician. Strauss was a marketing man. Hoskins was a machine person, basically computers in the very early days. And they knew how to make things work. So complementary, exactly as you said to Margaret Thatcher. Do you agree?
And then Harry. We'll just 2 at a time to speed it up.
Yes, I wanted to ask about Margaret Thatcher as a campaigner when she was in opposition, and in terms of her being a moderniser. And she was teased a lot, wasn't she, about using advertising agencies, using Saatchis for posters and party political broadcasts and all the rest of it. And so what is the lesson for, if anything, for Kemi Badenoch now at this phase for the Conservative Party in terms of effective campaigning in opposition?
Should we do stepping stones first? Charles, what would a modern stepping stones look like? As my memory of stepping stones is, it is all about the economy and the unions and getting the economic structure right. Would a modern stepping stones look like that?
By the way, it's worth bearing in mind that Mrs. Thatcher got extremely irritated by stepping stones. because she said, this is part of her, I think, her cunning, quality which she had, but which she always denied, which was itself, of course, a cunning thing to do. She said, I don't want everything worked out on graph paper. what she meant was you politics, you don't know what damn thing's going to happen next in politics. And so you mustn't have this sort of schedule you've got to fulfill, or what people sometimes call a grid. And so in that sense, you may have to throw away every stepping stone you've invented. But the exercise is worthwhile because you're trying to think through the order of what you're trying to achieve. And you're trying to test propositions all the time. So you certainly need to do that. And you need, therefore, to employ people who may not be very able politically. I don't mean they should all be no good politically, but I mean there's a use for people like John Hoskins who don't understand politics but do understand policy. And they then feed it into people who understand politics, and then there's a sort of creative tension between the two.
And Alfred Sherman?
Well, Alfred, yes, should have been mentioned because he was very important in all of this. And the reason he tends not to be mentioned is that he was extremely much disliked by everybody, almost everybody, because he was so violent in his opinions and rude. And but he was, and he was very much an ex-communist, so he had that sort of absolutism of the communist turned to a different ideology. But he did have the rigour to question every received idea, and she liked that until after a bit she could bear it no longer. But he did last pretty much all through opposition. It was only really when she got into government that he became sort of unbearable for her. So I think he was an important figure, and particularly, of course, in the Centre for Policy Study.
Advertising. Who wants to? Ross?
Yeah, well, Labour isn't working just immediately comes to mind. And if we, you know, every great campaign does crystallise its key message in such a kind of epithet, and I think we're a long way from finding what that will be at the next general election. But you know, Kemi will require strategists who are able to do that in the same way that Saatchi was able to do for Lady Thatcher, and so much of that knowledge, as it was then, is not inside the party, it's outside. And as Charles was saying, building that ecosystem of being able to draw on expertise from outside the traditional avenues of conservative policy and strategic advice is going to be hugely important, again, as it was the last time we had a huge electoral victory in 2019. And the other aspect that it made me think of was the classic way that Lady Thatcher communicated about Labour's economic failures. So we have a similar position now where we've had a Labour budget which is being massively criticised, but what she was able to do in so many people's imagination was translate that into the way in which she watched family budgets, was careful over cans of soup, and could translate the macro questions of Labour's economic failure into a way in which, you know, if I ask my family members and, you know, people of my parents' generation what they remember about Lady Thatcher's communication style, it's really that she translated so many of these questions to the kitchen table. And that deftness of touch in political communication is definitely a skill in its own right. I think it can be learned. I think it can be developed by looking at the model that she gives us. But that's something I feel that you know, the Conservatives can learn so much from again now.
I think the only point that I would comment on briefly maybe is stepping stones. I was rereading today as part of this my kind of Tory party, the Telegraph op-ed that Thatcher raised in 1975 as part of the leadership contest. And I do her a disservice by paraphrasing, but she essentially said, you know, politicians shouldn't be management consultants, they should concern themselves with people. And I think there's a great insight in that managerialism is not what politics is. And if that's all that, you know, I think sometimes it can sort of feel that way in the natural party of government kind of cliche. And if that's all the Conservative Party has to offer, then it might as well not exist. And I think that what she did so brilliantly, I mean, Charles has already said, is bring people in who could do that, but she didn't do that. So yes, I think quite possibly we could have a modern version of that, but that is something for professionals and those sorts of experts to do, and not for political leadership.
Can I just say, she was very, in some ways arrogant, but very, very humble about how to present herself. So she worked it out very carefully about if people said you must be different on television, she would be different on television. She'd have new teeth, literally, new hair, new clothes, new voice, anything which was, if something was getting in the way of the key message, she would alter it to get the key message. And it's particularly more important in a woman than a man because a woman's appearance is more commented on and noticed and is more different in a political environment than a man's, because a man essentially just wears a suit. Much more complicated with a woman. She would think about that very carefully. But she did have, as Katie's point is making, and Ross, she did have a natural ability to think about what something meant for people. And this was never conquered by officialdom. So let's give you a totally non-political example. She's going to see Gorbachev in Moscow. And as always happens on these occasions, the Prime Minister presents a present to the person they're coming to see. So Foreign Office provides a present. So they provide a pair of silver backed hairbrushes, and she writes on the memo about this, but he's bald. I don't think any other Prime Minister would have thought they'd just say, oh, thanks very much, here's the present. But she's sort of, and the classic housewife thing, which she did we should really mention it in the previous session, which was, they got up a campaign, the Heath people, William will remember this, I'm sure. She had given an interview in a magazine in which she had said that because of inflation, she would go and buy tins of things when she didn't immediately need them because the prices were going to go up. And the Heath people got up a great thing in the papers about this showed she was a hoarder, which had a big resonance because of the war, and it was a selfish act and so on. And all her team, particularly Erin Eve, said, she wasn't even the leader at this point. No, you've got to get away from this, etc. And she said, no, I'm not a hoarder. And I'll show them. And so she invited the press into her kitchen and opened the larder door and said, here is what I've got. And it's all listed, actually. In my book, it's sort of, 2 tins of sardines, 3 tins of peaches, spam, all the sort of...
It was one cupboard.
Exactly, yes. And I mean, the total number of things in there is only sort of 25 items or something. And there are all those rather horrible things people had to have in tins in those days. And the point is, she had taken straight on the criticism and seen it from the human and particularly the housewife point of view, and defeated them. So she out of and the same, of course, with the title Iron Lady that the Soviets gave her, but she adopted it. So she takes the enemy attack and she turns it into her weapon.
I'm just going to let Carol and William in from the first panel.
Very quickly, before the end of my mother's life, she said the problem with modern democracy is that good people won't run for office. Does the panel think there has been a noticeable decline in the calibre of people representing us in the House of Commons? And is that why we can't get some sort of international leadership to sort out, for instance, Zelensky or the Middle East?
And William, did you want to? It's right in front of you.
I was just going to make a small point about advertising. The Conservative Party invented modern campaigning. It went back in the 1880s and 1890s. And we shouldn't think that everything started in 1975. Harold Macmillan employed J. Walter Thompson to enormous effect. Heath had McCann Erickson. It was actually Heseltine who introduced the Saatchi brothers into the mix. So one of the things that the Tory party in any era needs to do, because it some ways has a more difficult message to sell than the others, is to be just more professional.
Yeah. Okay, and the quality of MPs and ministers. Anyone?
I feel I should recuse myself from this question.
Who wants to go first?
I'm going to recuse myself from commenting on members of the House of Commons, but the thing that I notice when I read accounts of the time, well, I'll come back to what I said in my opening statement. The professional staff and the advisors of the Conservative Party and the infrastructure around her was patently better resourced in many ways, more serious. It was a mid-career trajectory for many of her most senior and impactful advisors. I think we probably have lost some of that due to the structure of modern politics, and I say that as the 32-year-old who was the director of the Conservative Research Department at 28. It's not. I mean, it's always been a young training ground, but I think we probably have lost some of the infrastructure, and it's not just inside the party. And there were many great think tanks who are doing wonderful things on this, but she also benefited from a very wide sphere of conservative thought and serious policy work that existed outside the party and informed that she was able to draw on. It's there now, but it's difficult when you read the accounts of the time not to somehow feel that she was drawing on something more powerful than is necessarily at our fingertips right now.
I would just say that it's what we have is an artifact of what the population wants, whether we like it or not. And I think there are ways to build up and enhance the policy debates, but in a way, we're getting exactly the representation and the sort of leadership that the populace would like. It is true that if you go back in history, and certainly 1960s Parliament was average higher age and also much more sort of represented by people who would have prior careers, farmers, sort of teachers, etc. But the reality is that there is a skew, not just here in the UK, but globally towards younger leaders, and it may be also an artifact of the manner in which people get their messages out, going back to the point about message. I'm not at all saying that public policy or the issues around growth or education, helping public goods in general, is not important, but for whatever reason, and we can point to the media, we can point to the sort of how much sort of combat goes on in public policy debate, but whatever the impetus or the reason, there's a sense that public policy debates are not the reason that people are elected ultimately, and I think that's going to be a key piece of I would hope, of what future leaders think about in terms of their campaigns.
This is right, but it's a very strange thing, because you still win an election because you win a majority in the House of Commons. That's the only way you win an election. And you lose leadership if you don't lose it at an election because your MPs throw you out. And so the logic is you should develop much more the capacities of your MPs, and that Parliament should work more. And I don't mean by that it should be full of independent-minded MPs, because they can be a great nuisance when you're trying to transact the business of government. But you do need a body of people who are seriously legislating, and actually that doesn't really happen. And the big change there was with Tony Blair, who changed all the hours and therefore took away all power from opposition, and also by imposing, making the guillotine routine meant that legislation extremely poorly understood. And this means, first of all, the public don't respect the laws you pass because they are very bad. And secondly, that you don't really know what you're doing. And thirdly, that you're not really tested. You're tested by trial by media, but you're not tested. Both Ted Heath and Margaret Thatcher, as they became leaders of the Conservative Party, were right as they contested it, 65 and 75, were debating the finance bill in the House of Commons night after night. They were the Treasury spokesman, and they were talking about very detailed things about taxation at 2 in the morning for a sort of, eight debates. And they really, all their colleagues, who were the electorate, the only electorate at that time for the leadership, were watching it. And they could see what could they do, what did they know, how could they argue it. And that's really not there now. And so they're like, it's like nowadays politics is like the sort of parable of the sower, and the ones that shoot up very quickly because they get a quick social media thing, and then the plant dies suddenly, and on you go to the next one. And this, I think, I would really hope that the Tories in opposition take seriously the idea of improving Parliament, which she could take for granted, but they can't.
So the next hands I saw were Daniel Johnson and Mark Francois.
Yes, I wanted to mention, I hope this isn't wrong, my father, Paul Johnson, because he was Mrs. Thatcher's first great convert from the left. There were others followed, Hugh Thomas, John Vasey, many others. But I think it was very important for her morale, apart from anything else, to know that she could win over serious intellectuals on the left. But it was also important in a different way because I think Margaret Thatcher was always passionate about history and global perspectives. You know, she wasn't a narrow provincial British politician. She saw the bigger picture, and Charles and others have mentioned Gorbachev and the fall of the Berlin Wall and all the other great events that happened when she was in power. But long before that, even in opposition, she understood what the great battles of ideas were about. And she needed serious intellectual input for that. And she wanted to hear how someone from the other side saw what she was saying. And I do think there's a qualitative improvement in her speeches and her general presentation in the last couple of years before she won that great election in '79. And that was partly the input she was getting from these converts. So I'm wondering whether, you know, there is a lesson there now, you know, about how the Conservative Party and Kemi in particular can benefit from this. Because Kemi too is a product, I mean, she was hugely influenced, I think, by Margaret Thatcher as a young person, but also by the fact that she had experienced firsthand a repressive, statist, authoritarian regime. She knew what she didn't want. But I think she too needs that sort of intellectual firepower.
Right, Mark.
Thank you. Well, Mark Francois, Member of Parliament for Raleigh and Wickford, and an example of the declining quality of MPs in the House of Commons. If it's any consolation, I was chatting to someone at a party function at the weekend, an activist, and they said, what's it like being so heavily outnumbered in the House of Commons at the moment? And I said, it's a bit like Rorke's Drift, but without the 11 VCs, so we're doing our best. I'm one of 121 parliamentary survivors of the most gruelling general election I can ever remember, and I fought 8. Halfway through that, a couple of days after the D-Day debacle, I thought back to cutting my teeth as a Tory activist canvassing council estates in Basildon under Margaret's leadership in the 1980s. And one of the great benefits of that was the absolute clarity about what you were doing. When you knocked on a door with a blue rosette, the elector opened the door and the retail offer was very clear. What did you stand for? You stood for strong defences and standing up to the Soviet Union. You stood for market economics and sound money. You stood for law and order and supporting the police. You stood for curtailing excessive trade union power. They could love it or hate it, but they knew why you were there. But far more importantly than that, you knew why you were there. You were on a mission. You were part of a crusade to change your country for the better. Do the panel agree that if we're ever going to get back into government, we could do with a bit of that?
Right. Who wants to come in first on either of those things?
Well, I'll come in first on Mark's point. So there's a lot of discussion, and particularly I think following the most recent election, which was just as grueling as you say, where I think the age at which you became more likely to vote Conservative than Labour was 63, about how we might win back young people. And in the context of that discussion, I think the only answer to that is to have a moral mission. You know, what young people want is no different from what people want. They want to succeed, they want to have lives that they enjoy, security, families, and ultimately people want to be happy. And so I think if part of you know what we were saying earlier about Thatcher and her insights is she had that total not just philosophical and ideological clarity, but a moral clarity as well. And I think we need all of those things if we're going to convince the public that we deserve to run the country again.
I agree, and I think in your comments, Mark, there was a massive degree of realism about where the Conservatives are, and I think we can learn from Lady Thatcher facing that in the same clear-eyed way, being very realistic about where the Conservatives actually are politically. When she inherited the party, I mean, she later wrote, "There were too many Tory wishful thinkers who thought that it might result in the Conservative Party somehow returning to power with a doctor's mandate, and Ted had no doubt of his own medical credentials." And I think that's the trap, is that we don't face the reality of where we are with the same degree of realism that she did. And I think she drew on that as a source of strength rather than an admission of weakness. You have to be clear-eyed about how hard the road back to power will be in order to begin the work. And I think we've come some way towards that since the election that you talked about. But that election was so catastrophic for the Conservative Party because mainly we allowed ourselves to be split to the right, that it could be generational. So we have to be really clear-eyed about that threat and that issue if we're going to rebuild.
Last thoughts from Luther and Charles.
Maybe I'll just make a comment regarding the first question about conversion, the importance of conversion. And I think the best example of how important converting people from other groups is, not just in terms of winning an election, but the ability to govern, I think, is what's happening with Trump. In the last election, against many forecasts, many expectations, he won. I don't need to repeat every detail, but he won, women, blacks, Jews, Muslims, urban and rural. I mean, it was across the board. And I think it's clear that mandate has given him the power to actually, just in 2 weeks, to really affect a lot of change. FDR is the last person who had a similar sort of imprimatur. And I do think that the takeaway for us as we think about what are the lessons for the future are that we do have to think about governing in the world that we live in today, and that's just not simply dusting off past policies, even, no matter how much we loved them. It's about a recognition that we need to understand what the problems and the challenges of how smart people on the left and on the right are seeing the world in a different way. So especially now in the last couple of weeks, a lot of the conversations coming out of the incumbent, the Prime Minister's office and the Chancellor are things we wouldn't object to. More growth, we need to reduce regulation. I mean, those are not things that are antithetical to conservative values. And so I think we could concede and we could cede position if we merely insist that everything they say is wrong and not actually think about how we're going to deliver growth and progress in a way that is compatible not just to the right but also to the left.
Charles, last thoughts.
There comes you can tell a politician is doing well when suddenly a sense of possibility is created. And that's happened with Trump. I'm myself very, very critical of massive things about Trump, but it's unquestionably happened with this victory. And there was a feeling that Biden, and then you might have thought Harris would have changed that, but she didn't change that at all. So there was a sense of what on earth are they going to do that's worth, what are the possibilities that are going to open up with a Harris victory? And they really didn't seem to exist. And the Trump one does, and that has its own momentum. And the opportunity for the Conservatives does exist now, despite their terribly low electoral water, because even for somebody like me who was never going to support them, I thought maybe Starmer's Labour would be able to effect real change because we'd had so long of the Tories and they'd learnt some lessons from the Corbyn era and so on. And actually they have been incredibly bad at creating possibility, incredibly bad. They've created impossibility with immense speed. I think it's still early enough in their term that possibly could be reversed. I do think maybe if they get really going on, getting rid of planning restrictions and that sort of thing, it is possible. But the opportunity is there for conservatism because Starmer seems to me to be a phenomenon who's arrived at the wrong time. So he's come too late. He would have been okay about 5 years ago when he would have been better than Corbyn, but he still would have had all those orthodoxies he has and they wouldn't have been much question. But now, I really don't know. He seems to be very inflexible. I don't mean extreme, but inflexible. He can't sort of express new thoughts or approach a matter in different ways. So I thought there's a possibility to be unlocked there.
Great. Apologies to those of you who couldn't get in, but I'm under strict instruction to wrap up now. 2 things at the end. Just first, it was a marvellous first panel, and it's great to see all the panellists, as far as I can see, are still here, and it was really quite warming to hear those marvellous letters from Carol. We've also had a great second panel, looking forward to the future. Appreciative cough from the Director of Policy Exchange. And on that note, would you like to thank the panel in the